just to begin, could you just tell us who you are and what your current role is?
Well, by trade and training, I'm a philosopher. I do mainly ethics and political philosophy, but I trespass a good deal. And so here and there I've got myself into questions that bear on professional life and on education. And in a sense, thinking about trust and accountability, the themes I've dealt with today, are things that I came into by thinking about political philosophy. So that's not particularly biographical, but in the latter part of my career I taught at Cambridge. I was principal of Newnham College, and I've just completed supervising my last batch of PhD students.
One of the themes you talked to an extent about today was assessment. It would be useful to begin by asking you what do you think the purpose of assessment should be in education?
Well, I think there are many different purposes. The ones I listed at the beginning of the lecture are clearly one absolutely crucial use of assessment is formative. It is to give the student or the employee or any of us some feedback on how we're doing. And it seems to me that that is probably ultimately in education the most fundamental function of assessment. But of course it is not, as one of the questioners pointed out right away, it is not actually what the assessment system is being used for. It's being used for different purposes. It's being used, for example, to rank schools, or it's being used for employment decisions. It's being used for university entry decisions. So assessment data can be used for many other purposes. Very often, if it's known that that's how they're going to be used, it subtly corrupts the assessment. And that was one of my main themes today.
Well, that leads on to the next question, which is if there's a problem with what we currently have in terms of assessment, is it the fact that the assessment we're using is it flawed? Or is it the fact that we're interpreting the roles of that assessment and the data it generates in an incorrect or improper way?
I think very often it is that we're trying to use it for too many different purposes. We're trying to provide information for selective purposes. After all, getting a job, being admitted to a university degree, these are positional goods. Some get it, some don't. So it's being used for these high-stake decisions. It's being used then to hold the schools to account, whereas, as was suggested in the discussion, there's a very good reason for holding the schools to account in quite a different way for the sorts of ambience and support they give the children, rather than the league culture, league table culture, which has been so prevalent and is a problem.
It does lead us on to the idea of accountability, because there's the argument to say that when we do have accountability, we've got some idea of what's going on, and it helps us focus in a professional way, again, whatever that may mean, that if we know we're going to be held to account, the ideas of responsibility and why we do things are also explained to people as well. So do you feel that we're now over-accountable to the extent that people can't do their jobs well enough or in a good way? Or do you think it's that we're not understanding a good use of what accountability is?
I think it's closer to the latter. I'm not against accountability. In a sense, who can be against accountability? But accountability, as I see it, is rather specific for different purposes. You have financial accountability, and you could have various forms of professional accountability. What I think we've tried to do in schooling in this country is to merge many uses and to put them all on the same infrastructure. The infrastructure is pupil performance. And pupil performance is, well, you know, it's the child next door and the child in the next street at a certain stage of life, with whatever feelings they have about that subject, that teacher, and all the rest of it. And the schools are then, I suspect, tempted to push them to conform to certain models of the achieving child, the bright child, and my joke about the Stakhanovite child, I'm afraid that's not a joke. It is absurd how many different subjects, how many different exams young people are being put in for. And you find families where the parental generation hardly took an exam in their whole school days, who feel it's absolutely essential that little Johnny or little Janie is examined to pieces in the middle teenage years. And it's actually not essential. Many countries with quite good educational systems do much less examining, and they don't make the examination the way that they hold the teachers to account, the schools to account, the LEA to account.
It seems to me that there's a number of problems that are building up from this, not least in terms of how this affects our future society. I mean, if we look at national curriculum and assessment, what do we address first? I mean, you mentioned the examples of modern languages and some shortcomings that may lead to in our future society, and also science and the degrees and the number of people taking science degrees. So is it that we've got to change the curriculum first inside schools to get people back into this, or do we need to change the assessment of these subjects? Where do we start to solve this problem?
My sense of where the problem lay, I didn't go down to the detail of the curriculum, but I did suggest that maybe we have had a mistake or an unfruitful way of going about it in having so much choice, so that almost uniquely among school children, British school children are thinking what subjects should they give up, because they can, and they can give up some of the subjects which will later turn out to be absolutely crucial for certain things they'll want to do. So you have children, for example, who think, well, I'm not going to be a language teacher, so why should I do a language? Not realizing that if they want to go into marketing, actually, not all the world speaks English. The majority of web content is not in English. There are a lot of reasons, cultural in the first place, but quite simple career and employment ones for being linguistically competent, not to mention the good effects on your understanding of your own language. And here we are, rather uniquely allowing the cohort of the monoglots to grow. I find it extraordinary.
It's almost like there's a cultural myopia.
Absolutely. And then look at maths. I mean, in this country, in England, that is, not so, and in Wales, not so much in Scotland, but in south of the border, we are allowing young people to give up maths at 16. Of all subjects that are, as it were, skill base for later things, maths is obviously one. And it isn't as though we had enabled people to reach such a superb level at age 16 that we felt that they were equipped for life. And I can see why it isn't always fun. But if you don't accept, as I do not accept, that education is a sort of consumer choice activity, I think there are certain skill subjects that are valuable to people. They include maths, they include languages, they include your own language at a higher level, they include sort of writing, literature, reading texts, all sorts of things that are quite generic. But if you don't do them after a certain age, where are you?
It does make me think about how we change things, and the question in the audience was about, how we go back perhaps, but how do we move forward with this?
Yes.
What's the
really
steps we take? So what kind of steps would you like to see taken to change the situation, to think of our future societal needs?
I would count, it's quite an interesting thing. At A-level, as you'll know, at a certain stage, universities were only allowed to count the points on the first 3 A-levels. And that had a very clear rationale. It wasn't really valuable. You may say you don't accept the idea of an A-level as opposed to a baccalaureate system, and I would rather agree. But it wasn't really valuable for people to do 6 A-levels. However, at age 16, we have incentivized doing as many GCSEs as you can cram into the hours God sends. And you get these pupils like the one I chose as an example, the whippersnapper, who do more subjects than is necessary. And I think there might be something to be said for telling people that only their best 5, 6, 8 would be counted. Now, I think that given that there's very little money for any educational reform at present, the EBAC, which of course has its weaknesses, but the EBAC, which is giving an extra certificate for those who do, is it 5 or 6 core subjects? I think it...
I'm not quite sure.
I'm not quite sure. I mean, it is like now English, Maths, Science, but I think it includes second science, modern foreign language, and history or geography. And I would be inclined not to incentivize getting more than 6. Now, think what a difference that would make to the incentives for schools right away. To be sure, pupils could choose to do more, and they might have reason to do more, but you wouldn't have everybody trying to do as many as possible, and that would also reduce the incentive for putting people in for the subjects that will be easiest. And a relative of mine took, I asked him how his A-levels had gone. He said, it was all right, I got 6 A's. I said, that's very unusual at A-level. He said, no, most people at my school get 6 A's. I said, why? And he said, well, because the school makes it compulsory to do general studies. It's not taught, but we all have to take it. And compulsory to do critical thinking. Upon which he turned on me and said, I think some of the critical thinking examination was actually logically invalid. But, you know, what is that school doing? It's boosting its position in league tables by requiring all pupils to take 2 additional A-levels.
I think if we look at the content of your lecture and if people see that, they'll see the different themes of trust, accountability, responsibility, professionalism, and so on. But the last question I'd like to ask you is that if we was to leave here and say people to take away just one idea or one thing to think about in their professional educational roles for who may see this from a higher education world and perhaps the school world, what do you think that one key issue you'd like people to think about would be?
Every time you use a measure of pupil attainment for some extraneous purpose, you risk creating a perverse incentive. So every time you find yourself doing that or participating in a system that requires you to do that, ask, what incentive is this creating? Whom is it damaging? Pupils, head teachers, schools, employers, universities? And I think that would be a very useful first step. That's rather a Warwick Mansell point, isn't it?